Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
Coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, between the confluence of two rivers. We are happy to be here with you. The reason we're here with you is because of Imogene Ingredients. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. I'm Bo Bonner. You've probably heard me as the host of the Catholic Morning Show throughout the week. Bud's over here. How do people know you, Bud?
I'm involved in education, specifically downtown, even more specifically at Mercy College of Health Sciences, training the next future healthcare leaders of America.
Education. Education in the nation, Bud.
Wow, we need a theme song.
I think there's some song I have to be ripping off. One more time, though, the boys at Imogene Ingredients, good people, not only because of underwriting our show, which of course we're very appreciative of, but making a difference when it comes to care for cattle in and around Iowa. I think they're nationwide, but anyway, you should go check out Imogene Ingredients if you have such needs.
Yeah, I really like the guys at Imogene. I'm privileged to go to Mass with, be at the same parish as some of them. And when I landed at St. Augustine's here in Des Moines, I was just sort of amazed at how active their nights are. Mm-hmm. But there's also this kind of integration with Iowa Catholic Radio, because some of those Imogene/St. Augustine's guys were selling meats.
Yes,
at a fall fundraiser.
That's right.
I think Rob Den Hartog had a segment during
fall fun. That is true.
Last week.
And if there's something that can happen, there's going to be a St. Augustine's person at Iowa Catholic Radio. That is absolutely the case. But it is the holy month of October where we celebrate the Rosary of Our Lady. We have plenty to talk about, and we're going to get to it here soon. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this weekend. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making the show possible. Mean Imogene. I don't think that's their motto. And I don't mean that as bad. I mean, if you have cattle with hunger, these guys, it's not anger, but they have a devotion to making sure that your cattle are properly nutritionized. None of this has been run by Imogene. I'm just throwing this out. I hope that they appreciate it. We appreciate them underwriting the show.
My first soccer team that I was on was called the Mean Green Machine.
Yeah.
And you know how college football is really into alternative uniforms? We were way ahead of the curve. So we really leaned into, we had some pretty cool, shamrock green shirts. And we thought we were pretty bad as 8 and 9-year-olds.
Nice. That is really forward looking for the 80s.
Well, we actually didn't have alternate uniforms, but we took great pride in
You were an alternate uniform.
Yeah, just walking alternate uniforms.
I like that a lot. Well, Bud, one of the alternate names for October is the month of the Rosary. I'll act like that was a good segue. Mm-hmm. But yes, we have the month of the Rosary, and we were talking about it beforehand. We don't know if we've actually had a chance to talk specifically about the Rosary here on the Uncommon Good. There's a lot to talk about. One thing I think out of the gate about how this relates, at least tangentially, to things like Catholic social teaching. So, of course, Leo the 13th, very well known for Rerum Novarum and some of the most basic encyclicals that make the foundations of Catholic social teaching. He also wrote, if I'm not, I can look this up maybe, it's at least 2, I believe, encyclicals on the Rosary, and I actually think that those have something to do with sort of, if not straight politics or things like that, about the constitutive element of society more than people think. So, but yeah, the Rosary, I know, as your friend, played a pivotal role in you converting to the Catholic faith. You were actually, I think, into the Rosary before you were Catholic. So it makes a lot of sense and very fitting for us to talk about it today.
Yeah, I can come back to that in a moment. I think what you say about Catholic social teaching is a fascinating angle on this whole question, because on one level, the Rosary feels like the most personal of devotions. Mm-hmm. There's a way as an individual, you can be in your pew and really enter into this pious devotion, sort of it doesn't have to be prayed publicly. It's very popular as a personal devotion. But when you look into the history of it, there have been times, like we recently, of course, passed like the anniversary of the Battle of Lepanto, where whole communities prayed the Rosary for particular intercessions. We think of our friends down who live in New Orleans and sort of how Our Lady and her intercession has been significant in terms of like praying for protection from storms. But I think beyond that, Bo, like what is culture building for Catholics? And it's the prayer of the church. So the work of the church, the work of those who have dedicated themselves to religious life is the hours and this kind of rhythm of prayer that bathes the entire day. And so the church really inherited the Psalms from, the people of Israel, and the Psalms became the foundation of our prayer, not only within the context of the liturgy, but also just like the daily hours that religious would dedicate themselves to. And then the lay faithful, wanting to join into that sort of rhythm, embraced eventually the Rosary. The history of the Rosary, is a bit murky, like it goes back centuries past. I know there's a small T tradition about St. Dominic being gifted like the prayers of the Rosary. But at some point in history, the faithful wanting to join in the recitation of the 150 Psalms took on this devotion. And what's cool about it, like our image, I think, of praying the Rosary again is like sort of sitting in our pew in a quiet church. But the Rosary was a prayer because of the beads, because of the repetition of it, that the faithful, as they were going about their daily work, they could join mystically and spiritually with the prayers that were being offered by clerics throughout the day.
So all of what you're saying is absolutely correct, but I have to admit, wildly underestimating how much Leo XIII talked about the Rosary. So I'm going to bring this up because I think it will land where you're getting at. So, Supremi Apostolutus Officio on the devotion of the Rosary, September 1883. On the recitation of the Rosary, 1884. On the Rosary in public life, one that we should return to, September 1887. On the Rosary, September 1891. Also on the Rosary, September 1892. Commending devotion to the Rosary, September 1893. On the Rosary again, September 1894. On the Rosary again, September 1895. On the Rosary, September 20th, 1896. On the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary, September 1897. And once more, on the Rosary, September 1898. But I lost count. Now he did 88 encyclical letters, but that was at least 10? Maybe 12?
That's impressive.
And you start to think about like what that means to, the Pope, who really did very much found the idea of the encyclical letter as like a public teaching of the church that could be, read by all people. And we can get into like how like the address of the encyclical letters changed throughout time and things like this. But certainly setting up this idea that that the teachings of the pontiffs would be spread throughout the world, particularly because of the means of modern communication. At that time, it's not like they were putting entire encyclicals on telegraph, but certainly the ability for like the newspapers and things like this to print, and then eventually, yes, in fact, the radio and Leo XIII, first Pope on video. That the Rosary as this constant theme he keeps going to, he almost does a decade of encyclical letters on the Rosary, I just realized. That this starts to be this interesting idea that at the turn of the modern world, and the Pope most known for reviving both Thomistic philosophy to deal with the difficulties of the modern world, but also to sort of deal squarely with industrialism and sort of arising technologies, that the Rosary comes as the natural thing he keeps talking about. I think that starts to be significant for precisely the reasons that you were bringing up.
Yeah, and I think we shouldn't underestimate the way that prayer binds together the church. And we've talked about this on the show before, but we know in our culture that oftentimes when tragedies happen, public figures will say, well, we have to do more than pray. And it's sort of like this, like kind of downplaying of the roles of prayer in the wake of a terrible event. And maybe some of those folks are well-meaning, but it kind of misses the fact that nothing that we do apart from the power of God, as Catholics, like God's will undergirds our work. And there is a sense like I don't want to downplay activism per se, because like we shouldn't approach prayer as a kind of like excuse to be lazy in the things that God has called us to do. But I think like an activism that's divorced from prayer is just misunderstanding the very character of the life of the church.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to think which Nouveau theologian, like it's very obvious, and I'll kick myself if I don't think about it. There's a book called Prayer as a Political Act.
I wish I knew.
Daniel Liu wrote it. And this starts to be this convoluted question, right, in the modern world, where you start to see our willingness, like all the things you said, to split private life and public life, made it where we can imagine prayer as this thing that is not an action. Like, we have action and then not prayer. But this gets into learning things on air, bud, as we're talking. So there were 12 Rosary encyclicals by Pope Leo XIII.
That's kind of cool.
The majority of them all in September in anticipation of October, this month that we're in. And actually, the Va Benvenuto, which is the one on the Rosary in public life. You are all welcome is what that means in Italian. This is the one that evokes Mary under the title Queen of the Rosary and raised the classification of the Feast of the Rosary, October 7th, to a double of the second class. And this is where he actually devotes October to prayer for the Holy Rosary. Yeah. Now, this starts to be interesting in why this is connected. We can talk about Our Lady of Victory. That obviously is underlying all of this, and we can talk about that more in the Battle of Lepanto, like we have already mentioned. But Leo XIII is doing this because of, he invokes the Italians to do this to improve the situation of the church in Italy and for the freedom of the pontiff. Now, Bud, this is sort of your historical wheelhouse. I mean, I talk about in political theology and ethics terms, but this is like because of your Newman. By the way, shout out to John Henry Newman's feast this month too. So do you mind telling us about, like, why does a pope talk about freedom of the church and how this might actually have everything to do with what we're saying with recitation of the Rosary and the very real political historical situations on the ground in the Vatican?
Well, when I first started studying this history, it really surprised me because when you look at, like, the situation of Pope Leo today, I mean, thanks be to God, popes who live in Rome, live in the Vatican, like, they're well protected, you know, like their situation is, I was going to say comfortable, but like peaceful, etc. You don't have to go that far back in history to see something entirely different going on. Because I studied Newman during the later part of his life, well, he lived to see the pontificate of Leo XIII, who named him a cardinal. But right before that, there was Pius IX. And Pius IX is this really interesting figure. I don't want to overplay this next point, but he was seen when he was first elected as perhaps, like, quote unquote, like the first liberal pope of the modern age. Modern.
Yeah.
He was open to changes. Like, so the Vatican and its very structure, or like that Rome at that time, was very traditional.
Because Gregory the 16th before him? 14th.
Right, you're right around there.
Yeah, Gregory.
I want to say 14.
Teenager, and I mean, again, not to like beleaguer the point, but just to set like.
No, you might be right because I don't think there's a Gregory in the 21st century.
Whatever it is he was doing his best play acting like nothing had changed since before the French Revolution, even though basically everything had.
So, I mean, to give you sort of like a marker, like even kind of a resistant to like street lights, like lamp lights.
Streets.
Yeah, you know.
Paving them. He was worried about it. No, I mean, like, we're not even lying.
So when Pius IX comes to the throne, like there are folks who are saying like, oh, maybe like this will lead to the church modernizing in good, healthy ways or whatnot. Eventually, though, because of revolutionary forces at the time, so already by that time there had been attacks on the papal states, meaning there were secular governments who wanted to claim parts of the lands that at that time belonged to the church. Mm-hmm. And there's a movement to unify Italy, so you start to see the rise of nation states in the centuries preceding this, and there's this idea like we can make Italy one people, one land, and part of that is taking the lands that belong to the church.
Asterisk to this too, right? Just to show you that like how Italy can always just be a fun outlier in history. they're having all this revolutionary fervor in the 19th century, right? This is the 1800s. What is their revolutionary fervor? To have a king. So somehow they're being revolutionary about having a king. It's like, man, Italy, you got to catch up.
Right.
No, I'm telling you.
Yeah. So Pius IX, as he sees these things taking place, he has a sort of like personal retrenchment. Like he kind of like...
Yeah, because someone tried to kill him.
Yeah, they actually killed his Secretary of State.
Who was standing next to him.
Yeah, he's like on the portico of St. Peter's or something like that.
He used to escape
assassinated.
for a while. Yeah.
So some of Pius IX's handlers, like they dress him up as a parish priest, sneak him out of Rome. I can't remember the town they sneak him to, but he has to flee Rome in a disguise to save his own life.
Yeah. This is all within 200 years ago, people. Like, yeah.
This is 1860s.
Yeah.
And so when Pius IX returns to the Holy City, he's not quite as keen on like modern revolutionary political movements. This comes to a head during the First Vatican Council. So most of you listeners are probably familiar with the most recent Council of Vatican II during the 1960s. 1869 to 1870, Vatican I takes place. On today's show, we don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of that. But during the council, there are military forces that invade Rome, and they have to, like, it halts the council, calls it to a close. And Pius IX essentially becomes a prisoner in the Vatican.
Correct.
So Leo XIII, he follows Pius IX, and so he's writing these encyclicals on the Rosary as a prisoner in the Vatican.
Yes. I mean, and so prisoner in the Vatican can maybe seem weird to people, but like, for instance, when you, with all the modern popes, but particularly starting with John Paul II, when they're like globetrotting, we can talk about like the perceptions that make and blah, blah, blah in modern media. You know, we've all talked about this ad infinitum. But one thing in mind, even John Paul II, even though he's not Roman, and maybe it's because he's not Roman that he feels like he can do this, but the Pope traveling around the world was like spiking the football on about 100 years of like popes thinking they could not leave or otherwise things would get bad.
Right.
I mean, like literally, not only do, you know, and it's different with each pope. With Pius IX, it's straight up, I think he was worried if they left, they would invade the literal building. And with Leo XIII, he had such a long pontificate, probably like depends on what time period you're talking about. But it's certainly the case that for a long time, the popes were like, we're staying put so that there's nothing that like no one gets any ideas.
I appreciate the church's modality during that era because they start to write these concordats or agreements with other countries. And all the way into the 20th century with like Pius X, Pius XI, they refuse to like recognize Italy as, they treat it as like, no, this was wrongly taken from us.
Yeah.
But there's this real sort of like, it's kind of a principled resistance to these movements. And that's why when you get to someone like Paul VI, when he goes to the Holy Land and when he goes to New York, it's like a huge deal. People are like, oh, the Pope is like leaving the Vatican.
Yeah, and I mean, and one thing that's like undersold again, because like you said, John Paul II sort of made it his own so much. But of course, the popes through the world wars, I mean, like, first of all, they're not leaving because of the world wars. And then second, even in the interwar period, the turmoil that I think we all don't understand. So when the Rosary very much, you know, and it's like you said, like we could get into like very deep histories of like the Rosary through time. When does it really get formalized? Obviously, by the time of the Counter-Reformation, that really is sort of its like day in the sun sort of deal, you know. And like, I mean, again, you probably know more about the Rosary history specifically. Isn't it the Counter-Reformation where we really do see like the Rosary looking like it would in modern day?
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of like the Mass, like the Mass is kind of like formalized, or like there's a sort of uniformity that's achieved post-Reformation. But before then, like there's this continuity.
Rosaries, But the point that I'm getting at is like, so while you have as a devotional aspect the Rosary come into its own Counter-Reformation, where you get this sort of, again, not political Rosary as in like politicizing the Rosary, but when you get this idea of like Rosary as social action, it really is Leo XIII that solidifies it, and it's over the question of the church in Italy and the freedom of the church. And I'll be honest, but when that even gets translated as freedom in English, we could get into, like, we could do multiple episodes on whether there's a difference between freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
But I think you most often classically see it as the liberty of the church. And the reason I like that is, like, the freedom part, it gets one part right. Like, literally, would the Vatican state be seen as, like, its own entity that is allowed, its sort of own ability to exist? That would be one. But liberty of the church, right, is to say that the nations of the world are subordinate, actually, to the spiritual realities that the church embodies. And so for the church to be at liberty to do what it is called to be in the world, it has to have this terrestrial freedom that was under attack. And so when Americans, like, this is what I think we're angling at, but it's like, when in America we think, like, oh, we should pray the rosary about abortion, right? For instance, like, that's been a long-standing thing with the pro-life movement. Regardless of any sort of specifics about, did it work? Are we over-politicizing it? There's all sorts of very particular American questions that you could ask or point out or have different debates about. But the impulse about when we need social action, the first thing Catholics think is pray the rosary. One of those nodal moments is Leo the 13th. In the next we still have a little bit of time here. I think in the next segment we can talk about Our Lady of Victory. But the sort of political action, if you want to pray for the liberty of the church in some regard, or like where the social reality of the church, it becomes instantiated in a people, and to say, quote unquote, more than just a devotional, not bashing it as a devotional, just saying as a second thing that the rosary becomes. October, month of the rosary. That's Leo the 13th again, man, like right in the wheelhouse of our show.
Right. And that's, you and I, this last week, we were out to dinner with our wives, and we were subjecting them to some theological conversation. But I think with the rosary, so the idea we were going back to, our good friend of the show, Will Kavanaugh, a great theologian, he talks about this idea of excarnation and the way that the modern world and some of its technologies and dynamics push us into a place that's like excarnational. So you think about the incarnation, God becoming human and entering into like our experience and taking on every facet of human life except for sin. Excarnation would be like kind of the reverse of that. Mm-hmm. And I think like the rosary is maybe the most powerful tool that we have to root us in a sort of like incarnational understanding of the faith. I was talking to a friend at work recently, and not a person of faith, and we were talking about like there are ways that Christianity connects with other religious traditions. So like in terms of its understanding of the good and the beautiful and this idea of transcendence. And as Christians, as Christian thinkers, like we can have conversations with folks who practice other faiths and say like, I see this kind of overlap.
Right.
But there is, to the Catholic faith, a kind of particularity that's really significant. So God enters into human history. He calls a people to be a blessing to all nations. And then salvation history is worked out through that people until we come to the birth of our Savior. But as it's so important to emphasize, like Jesus didn't just appear on the scene. You know, it's not like God used a stork to deliver a baby. Mm-hmm. He was brought into the world through Mary's fiat. Yeah. And, you know, Mary is
the portal of grace.
The portal of grace, like a law-abiding person, like a member of the people of Israel. And so it's, you know, even today, like you asked me about my conversion experience, we come to know Christ through her as well. And it's like you cannot bypass Mary to get to Jesus.
And I think that starts to be where this rosary of social action stems from, the particularity of the theology of the devotion. And what I mean by this is it shows the docility of the church, but also, like you said, the incarnational reality of the church, that when the church faces an existential crisis as an institution, right? The Italian monarchy, it seriously, like you could imagine it deciding it wanted to confiscate the buildings of Christian Rome belonging to the the patrimony of the Italians or whatever. And what did the church do? What did the Vicar of Christ do on earth? Turn to Mother Mary. Right? Like, as children in need of hope, we turn to our mother because we know Mary is the portal of all graces. And the idea, of course, like, and you'll hear people talk about like the political life of Mary, right? And like things like the Magnificat and like, casting down people from thrones, lifting up the lowly. Everything about Mary is incarnational, real, of the ground, of the people, of the real world. And because that also spiritual, the portal of eternal graces, that intersection that we find in Mary is the intersection of when things are necessary for the church, that we turn to her in prayer to instantiate that reality of grace we believe in. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Make sure to stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. One more time, thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making the show possible. Bud, it is the month of October, the month of the Holy Rosary, and we've been doing our best to dive into why the Rosary, just talk about the Rosary because it's good to talk about our Mother's Rosary, Mother Mary, during the month of October. But it's also important, it seems to me, that on the show, The Uncommon Good, about Catholic social teaching, to talk about how threaded throughout Catholic social teaching the Rosary is. We were talking about how Leo the 13th, in the midst of the 80-some encyclicals that he made, 12 of them devoted to the Rosary, most of them September, preparing for the month of October, which he dedicated to the Rosary for the reality of the Church on the ground. And I just want to start real quick with a few quotes from the encyclical specifically on the Rosary and public life. Then I think we can get into even more of the history, the personal history aspects of the prayers. So he starts out the encyclical, "You know how we place amid present dangers our confidence in the glorious Virgin of the Holy Rosary, for the safety and prosperity of Christendom and the peace and tranquility of the Church. Mindful that in moments of great trial, pastors and people have ever had recourse with entire confidence to the august Mother of God, in whose hands are all graces. Certain, too, that devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary is most opportune for the needs of these times. We have desired to revive everywhere this devotion and to spread it far and wide among the faithful of the world." We often, at times already, in recommending the pious practice of devoting October to the honoring of Our Lady, have pointed out our reasons and hope for doing so and the forms to be observed. And the entire Church, docile to our desires, has ever replied with special manifestations of devotion. The last thing I want to point out is he goes, let me get to where I was. It cannot be concealed that although thanks to the mercy of God, religious feeling is strong and widely spread among Italians, nevertheless the evil influence of men in times of religious indifference is on the increase, and hence there is a lessening of the respect and filial love for the Church, which was the glory of our ancestors, in which they placed their highest ambition. So just a glimpse, I think, of why he thinks the Rosary and public life. So he himself is saying the private devotion is, 2 thumbs up, 5 stars, but that there's a public devotion aspect of the Rosary, precisely in what he saw as increasing public indifference, encroachment of states on the liberty of the Church. And, but those are still things, about 100, more than 100 years later that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, and that's where, so if you say to someone, I'm a follower of Jesus, and they say to you, what does it mean to follow Jesus? The natural place to go to is the Sermon on the Mount. Mm-hmm. Like, this is when our Lord gave basically like the heart of his ethical teachings. There are other parables and passages that are really, really significant. Of course, any part of the New Testament we can read for edification. But if you get to like the core, like the foundation, you can go to the Sermon on the Mount. It struck me when I was first becoming Catholic that when Mary is called to be the one who would bear the Savior of the world, she says, all generations will call me blessed. And she kind of makes this sort of prophecy. And I realized as I learned the Rosary and would pray it with other Catholics, that was the literal fulfillment of this prophecy. Mm-hmm. Like in the Rosary, we bless the name of Mary. We do that daily. We ask for her intercession at the hour of our death. And in so doing, we bring to fulfillment what she says in the Gospels. So if you say like follower of Jesus, go to the Sermon on the Mount. When you think about devotion to Mary, I think you mentioned it during the first segment. Like, well, what does it mean to have this kind of devotion to Mary? Well, daily we pray the Magnificat, right? And I didn't think about this before the show, Bo, but like this has a very like social, political connotation. And to fully understand that, you have to understand when readers first encountered this account of Mary's Magnificat, or maybe prayed it in the context of the liturgy, their minds, as those familiar with the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, would have gone back to the Song of Miriam. Mm-hmm. And the Song of Miriam in the Old Testament is a song that's Moses' sister, right, Miriam?
Yes. Yep.
And after God provides victory over the Egyptians by like casting them into the sea, she prays, let me just make sure I get this right. I got it right here. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea, horse and chariot, right? And this song is threaded throughout, Israel's history as a reminder of God providing victory over their enemies. Mary, like, she harkens back to that famous song. She sings her own. And as you can hear in the text, like, she's looking forward to the salvation that God will bring. And this is not sort of like, well, at the end of our lives, he'll draw us up to this pie in the sky, right? It does have eschatological connotations. But like you were saying, he has cast down the mighty from their thrones. He has lifted up the lowly and filled the hungry with good things. The rich he has sent away empty. He has come to the help of his servant Israel, for he remembered his promise of mercy, the promise he made to our forefathers, to Abraham and his children forever. So what I think about when I hear that prayer is like when we see those things taking place, like when we see the hungry being filled and the mighty cast down, like that's the inbreaking of the kingdom that God's bringing to fruition.
Absolutely. And when we think about, so the connection arc through so much of this, I'm starting to see. We learned so much just choosing topics and then talking about them live. So I love that you brought up the Song of Miriam in Exodus, right? Mm. Where if you want to talk about, of course, there wasn't the Rosary back then because it's before Jesus and everything. But your connection's spot on because you're like in this time of desperation. What was the battle at the Red Sea? A battle where the Hebrews didn't raise one sword.
Yeah.
And God intervened for them. And so, like you said, that connection between Moses' sister, then going into the Magnificat. But then you think about Our Lady of Victory, right? Our Lady of the Rosary, where this comes about, the famous Battle of Lepanto, where the Christian navies of combined Europe completely outgunned by the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. And if you're talking about just like if you played it on a board game and it was dice rolls, Ottoman Empire wins almost every time. And the Pope asks all of Europe to devote praying to the Rosary. Again, this is where people go like, oh, this sounds like ultra Christendom, or like, oh, so we're saying the Rosary is like what helps navies fight better. And you're like, say what you want, pacifist, just war theory person, whatever you are. The Ottomans were likely to invade Italy at that time and then probably even go to the New World. Mm-hmm. Europe was facing very dire times as Christianity, as Christian Europe. And when all else failed, they sung a song to Mary. They prayed the Rosary, and then when the victory was at hand, and it wasn't some sort of like sweeping victory, and that shows the Ottomans we were really powerful and cool, but it stopped the expansion that really looked like it was on the horizon. And you think about like that willingness to turn to the Mother of God in that time of need. Same thing with Mary, with what Leo the 13th was trying to pull off. I mean, everything in Europe. Yeah. Going into the 1800s looked like the church was completely cooked. It was done with. It was over. And yet here we stand on the other side of at least 2 to 3 like specific revivals of Catholic devotion, even in Europe, right? Depending on what you want to call like the uptick now. And you start to see this pattern, bud. Like that's, and like you said, it's both incarnational and fulfillment of Scripture, that when we do these things, we act like Mary and we answer the call of the Beatitudes.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about the way that God's activity in history oftentimes has these kind of patterns. So you mentioned like how the victories of today can like harken back to Mary's Magnificat. I was thinking of actually a class that I took in grad school. You're familiar with the New Testament scholar Joel Marcus. It was a class on the Gospel of Mark. He's encapsulated it in a book called The Way of the Lord. But if you want a cool experience this next week, read the book of Exodus in a sitting or two, like maybe a couple evenings in a row, and then follow that immediately by reading the Gospel of Mark. Because Joel Marcus shows, and like this is sort of, this is entering into a deeper understanding of what God accomplished in the person and work of Jesus Christ. He shows how the Gospel of Mark, there's so many echoes and reverberations from the Exodus. And so the author of that gospel basically uses the Exodus as a framework to show what Jesus was about. So you think about, I mentioned the Sermon on the Mount. That is like, our Lord is a new and greater Moses. Moses gave us the Decalogue or 10 Commandments. Christ, comes to this mountain and delivers like a sort of commentary or expansion, elaboration on those commandments of God. Christ, of course, is the Passover lamb sacrificed on our behalf. But in the Exodus, God saved his people from slavery in Egypt, from bondage. Christ saves us from the bondage of sin. The Rosary played a role in the victory at Lepanto. And then today, I think on the show, we've been talking about how digital technologies, consumerism, these kind of like dynamics in the postmodern world can be a sort of bondage. And so like what God is doing in our midst, hopefully today, we could call it a revival, but drawing us out of maybe patterns of life that have become enslaving to us.
Well, and on on that final note, it's funny. I just got done teaching a class pointing out the overlap of Exodus and John's gospel. And, it's interesting just on that side note, I'm with you and with Joel Marcus that Mark sort of just embodies it. John actually has quite a bit of commentary where Jesus himself specifically is talking about how important the Exodus is. You think about, the snake in the desert, manna from heaven. So, yeah, that's very important. And also, again, like the role Miriam and Miriam, or like the women involved in those stories, even though like people like growing up Protestant sort of like whiz right past them. But like you go back and look and you go, oh no, very important pivotal moments where the women involved are very important, also with the Gospels, but of course thinking about Mary.
And I like John where he's like, in case you missed it.
In case, yes, yeah.
He's like, Christ's sacrifice on Calvary is taking place against the very backdrop of the lambs being sacrificed at Passover.
Yeah, no, John is on the nose. Like Mark implies, Mark implies, John explicates. But to your point about, you weren't going to get out of this, folks, without us talking about media and technology, of course. But the Rosary ends up always being something I bring up, Bud, because it's the height of Protestant misunderstanding about the way a new technology made them think totally different about the faith. And so, there's no such thing as the book of the Bible until the printing press. There were scriptures, and the scriptures, right? The Holy Scriptures. Like I always notice it's plural S. It's not Holy Scripture, it's Holy Scriptures, right? Because it's like all these books, right? And people thought of it as a unified thing because it was the unified thing liturgically, right? Like we always prayed them out loud at Mass. When the books of the Bible become the Bible, Biblio, the book, that really changes how things look, right? So like now it's this like book because it's bound together. And so people start reading it like this sort of like, even though everybody knew that there was a unity to it, now there's like this material unity. And this is why I think the Rosary starts to come under, and prayers like the Rosary, like litanies and things like this, start to come under the gun from Protestants as if they're like vain repetitions. But to me, this is where they are accusing an older scriptural and oral culture of not being authentic because they don't realize they're imbibing a new form of media and not realizing how much it's influencing what they're thinking about. Because, of course, in oral cultures, and even when the printing press comes on board, and even for a few hundred years after it's made, the vast majority of everyone who is Christian is illiterate. Now, they hear the scriptures, right? That's why you have a priestly class throughout history, is you have people, you've trained people to read so they can read out loud and you can hear it. But how do you make present something when you can't write it down? Like when you write something down or you print it, it's present there. You're like, oh, I know it's in the book. How do oral cultures make something present? They say it over and over again. Yeah. And so the Rosary as sort of the deep longing of the peasant culture of Christianity, that like the Rosary itself is the form of the prayer of the poor, that the poor, like the repetitious prayer is seen as something as like superstitious. And what you start to realize is there's sort of like a classism over against the Rosary, which is like, well, you can't afford books. You don't know how to read. You're just a dumb peasant with superstition that repeats mantras to the Mother of God, whom you have too much of a devotion to because you're not a sophisticated, smart theological subsect like us. I know that's like sounds like the rudest way to put it, but that is some of the polemics that emerge. Yeah. And so the Rosary as being Mary's maternal love for the poor, for the simple, for the peasant, for that group is really important, Bud. And so like that's a historical reason why we should pay attention to the medium through which the Rosary is passed down. But another one is that's something that we need to revive and retrieve in the digital age, which is to say we, through our orality, through speaking the prayers together, make present a reality in a world that seems where nothing can be made present because of how fragmented the digital arena makes it seem sometimes.
Well, the church in her wisdom wanted the faithful to know the Bible, but there was this sense of like, how do you best internalize the mysteries of the faith? Mm-hmm. And so if you're learning to play basketball, a poor coach would be one who says, I'm going to teach you to do a mean crossover between your legs and then throw a behind the back pass the first day of practice, right? Like you build this foundation. And so these devotions, like the Rosary, like think about the mysteries of the faith, the major events in Christ's life that are built into the very recitation of the Rosary. And then with the liturgy, before the changes to the liturgy in 1970, the lectionary was just a 1-year cycle. And so you heard the same passages year after year, and kind of a hermeneutic of uncharity. Like people could look back on that and say like, oh, like the church wasn't giving the people like the full, expanse of the faith. But really, I think it was this sense like we're going to identify the foundational pillars and like really hammer those home and build them into people's lives.
Yeah. And again, I mean, it's give with one hand, take with the other, because to your point, through most of human history of the church, that's what people, the memories they have through having it ingrained in them is going to be what they remember most. And to your point, it would be really hard to, I mean, we know this is the case. Like, how many lectionary years are there? 3. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't even give all of the Bible, not all of the Bible gets said in Mass with a 3-year lectionary. I think there's real questions to ask if you memorize things if you only hear them every 3 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just like the educator in me. I don't know. I mean, certainly it comes somewhat, but like, usually the problem is the people you're asking this are like theology nerds like you. So they're like, oh yeah, I love this. But I wonder with like the hoi polloi, if you only hear something once every 3 years, I wonder if that's regular enough for you to remember it as a human. Yeah. That's an open wondering. But to your point, to go, okay, if we're going to drill in the foundations and then we can expand. So in the past, that's because people didn't have ready access to education. What's funny now is we've sort of burned through this idea, like this hope that, well, everyone would get educated. And then what are they going to do, bud, when they get educated? Well, they'll sit around and they'll read lectionary A, B, and C. But now people are accosted by too much information. And I somewhat think that like getting back to like, I think the wisdom of having foundations that we return to over and over again, it's one more time where the wisdom of Mother Church knows better than people think sometimes.
Well, and this is where I can go back to my own experience and how important all of this was in my own life. So it might be difficult for some listeners to kind of like enter into this mindset, but I grew up in a tradition that was suspicious, if you don't want to say like suspicious of Our Lady, like of the devotion to Our Lady. So like you think of the Salve Regina and the phrase like our life, our sweetness, and our hope. When some Bible Christians hear things like that, it just hits them the wrong way. And they think like that level of piety or devotion should only be reserved for the Son of God.
Even though they talk about their grandmas. Like
okay.
This.
Right.
I mean,
we could do a whole nother episode on that sort of thing. But so I was learning more about church history. I was being drawn into more liturgical expressions and things like this, but I still, like there was a part of my heart, you could say, that was like not there. And at Duke, when we went to Duke Divinity School in North Carolina, Like that year we were...
Coach K came to you.
Yeah, exactly.
No,
it was wonderful.
No.
We were assigned a spiritual director. Now, I mean, using that term loosely, maybe not exactly how it operates in the Catholic Church, but someone who weekly we would meet with, and it was supposed to be not simply academic. Like, how are these things like intersecting with my life? And eventually I told Duke assigned me Sister Joanna Walsh, a Catholic nun who was working in campus ministry. And one week I remember telling her, like, Sister, I'm thinking about becoming a pastor, but when I pray, like, it all feels so arid and dry. And she kind of like, she knew like this might not land with me. So she's like, you know, take this or leave this. But in the Catholic tradition, we have this ancient prayer that many people find helpful to both concentrate, but also, you know, like sort of be still in the presence of God. And she taught me to pray the Rosary. And it was through that, I mean, there's a particular experience that was significant, but through that I was like slowly drawn into the Catholic Church. And when the day that I was received and confirmed, it was pretty cool because the priest told a story of Mother Teresa's Marian devotion and how she felt like Our Lady sort of like enfolding her arms around her during a time in her life when she was, you know, destitute and emotionally dry. And it resonated with my experience, but the priest also, Father James Garneau, shout out, he used this phrase from the Gospels. He says, you know, like we do have some Christian brethren who see Mary as a kind of obstacle, but he says, go back to the wedding at Cana. And what does Our Lady say? She says, do whatever he tells you, mentioning her son. And I think with any sort of Marian devotion, particularly the Rosary, it's not something that draws us away from Christ. It draws us deeper into the mystery of Christ because insofar as we're devoted to Mary, and this is both personally and communally, we're going to do whatever Christ asks us to do.
Absolutely. And our life, our sweetness, and our hope, very prudent, wise ways to wrap up the Salve Regina, whoever wrote it, because our life should be an imitation of hers, right? If the more we are like Mary and become pregnant with Christ, as it were, the more we are true Christians. Our sweetness, because as you know, people have in multitudes of times said that like when you feel desolation, when it's hard to be a Christian otherwise, that Mary is there willing to intervene as a mother. And our hope, because she who was assumed into heaven is the hope we all have, that we can follow her path and be like her and live the life she does in heaven now. So, yeah, to have a problem with our life, our sweetness, and our hope, I think is, I'm going to declare it officially on here, bud, bad theology. Bad theology. And on this, and on this this month of the Holy Rosary, I think it important to see both how the personal and I mean the political, not in the personal and the polis. Let's say this: the city and the soul, right? The city of God in the city of man, but in our soul, which is a citadel for the Holy Spirit, and in our society, if we be willing to turn to Mary. And the Rosary being that sort of social action, just as it's a personal action, that we will be amazed again and again about the way that our mother intervenes and that she is truly a portal, the quickest route, the surest route to her son and his Sacred Heart, which, of course, is the common destiny all humans should share. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Wonderful to have you with us. Bud, again, we say this all the time. It's a broken record. A broken record, we're saying. I knew what we were going to talk about today going into the show, but every time we do the show wants to reveal something to us, I feel like. I feel like the show is the third host. It's you, me, and the show itself. And the show showed me something today. I didn't make all of those connections beforehand about Mary, but really, October... a fascinating, important month, and I'm really surprised about how much Pope Leo XIII showed up today in our discussion.
Yeah, it was great. I like that. I mean, we're blessed, as we've mentioned before, to be in people's homes and their cars, you know, like, and sort of like allow us to have these conversations with you.
The radio, not us. We don't go to your home.
Well, our voices.
Yes.
But I'm always amazed to see where the conversation goes.
Okay, I ruined it. You go ahead.
But we also invite you to join us and our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. You can do so anytime, anywhere. Just jump on the app. You can pray the Rosary using the Iowa Catholic Radio app. But we also broadcast it on air at 4:30 a.m., 6 a.m., 10 a.m., 8:30 in the evening. Chapel of Divine Mercy at 2:57 p.m.
It was especially important today talking about the Rosary. I realized that that's something we've been doing for a long time.
It's a huge part of the radio program.
Making sure that you can be a part of the radio and pray the Rosary in that sort of public action, like we've been saying. You can also make sure to be up to date with what's going on in and around Iowa Catholic Radio by going to the iowacatholicradio.com and the events page. But also, folks, this is not just the ministry of the people behind the mics, the boards, and the desk. It is your ministry as well. You make it possible. Go to iowacatholicradio.com to donate safely and securely there. Thank you for making this show and all of our shows possible. Bud, as always, blessings, wonderful show. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.